We're going to ask tough questions today, all right? And questions that were submitted by the audience. So this is all grassroots questions. So thank you also to everybody that submitted. And thank you for attending, of course. And I always like to say this. Thank you to Carly, our intrepid marketing manager, for putting this all together. She's wonderful, and we're so lucky to have you. This session, like you saw, is being recorded. And it's going to be sent to everybody who registered within 24 hours after the event. So go ahead and look out for that for an email from Carly. So first off, I'd like to introduce our panelists. So first off is Marina Dalton Brown, is a global public health professional with over 15 years of experience leading and supporting health programs across the Caribbean region, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Asia. She worked with Population Services International for over a decade, as well as the UN Women and the Pan American Health Organization. She holds a Bachelor of Science degree in biology and a graduate diploma in health management, both from McGill University, as well as a Master of Public Health degree from St. George's University of Grenada. Marina believes that ordinary people have the power to influence health systems, and that reframing the language and visual narrative of development can inspire systemic change. Next up is Sabrina Walker Hernandez, is a certified consultant, coach, facilitator, and best-selling author that helps nonprofit and mission-driven organizations build relationships and increase revenue through strategic planning, board education, and leadership development. She has over 2 decades of experience in nonprofit management, fundraising, and leadership. Sabrina is certified in nonprofit management by Harvard Business School. Frank Velasquez Jr. is a racial and gender equity advocate who leads and collaborates with passion, authenticity, and an open mind. He connects to the stories that make each of us who we are and the stories that inextricably connect us to each other. As founder of Fortahood and creator of the groundbreaking program Ascending Leader in Color, Frank brings local, regional, and national attention to the inequities that communities of color face, so that they too can economically advance and build their generational wealth. And finally, of course, last but not least, is Marshall Stowell, oversees global health communications on policy and advocacy team at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and is also the CEO and founder of Intentional, which is a collaborative of disruptors, individuals working to rebalance power, shift harmful narratives, and build strategies and programs that are equitable and effective. Intentional is driven by a single principle. Greater impact and equity comes when communities have more power and control. Marshall has dedicated his professional life to working in leadership roles in foundations and nonprofits addressing some of the world's most challenging health and human rights issues, where he's grappled with the imbalance of power between funders, organizations, and the communities they serve. So wonderful. Thank you all for being here. Let's go ahead and we'll go and get into it. We're just going to go, the way this is going to work is I'm just going to read the questions that everybody submitted, and then I'm going to pass it off to one of our panelists, and we're just going to go around the horn kind of like that. So question number 1, and this is, I'll say the overarching topic. So storytelling strategies. This was submitted by Julio. How do you approach, and this is for Marshall, how do you approach storytelling while trying to be empathetic to stories that may contain a lot of sensitive material for the subjects? For example, TBI, PTSD, or mental health loss. Marshall, we'll kick it to you.
Thank you. That's such an important question. And before I answer it, I'm going to step back and give you a theory that I have. I think, we're focused a lot on ethical storytelling, which I'm going to be super frank. I feel like at times is a cover your ass strategy by organizations to tick the boxes and say, I got consent, I'm doing no harm, etc. There's asset-based framing, which puts the pressure on the system, not the person. So a person experiencing homelessness versus a homeless person. What I'm arguing is that when we narrate stories, we give people 2 roles, and you brought it up, empathy and competence, right? Competence is usually reserved for staff, for people with money, white people usually, that are giving their advice and guidance on what needs to happen. The people who are depicted from the empathetic standpoint are the quote unquote beneficiaries, people being served. And so that's generally the role that they're cast in, is one of empathy. So I'm going to push back on the empathetic part and say, what would it look like to cast the people served in the role of competence and a competent voice? So starting with this is what's happening in my world. This is my advice and guidance on what needs to happen more or what needs to happen less. And then if I'm feeling like telling my story, I'll go ahead and tell it. But I think we have to be okay with people.
Oh, Marshall, you went on mute somehow.
I think
There
we
we
have
go.
to be okay with leading with advice and guidance, and then allowing people to tell their stories if they feel like it's appropriate for them. But start first with asking what their advice and guidance is.
Beautiful. Beautiful. And I'll also encourage any other panelists to sort of jump in afterwards if they have anything to add. Otherwise, we can go on and go to the next question. Thank you for that, Marshall. Next topic, using asset-based language, which is what we just talked about. Now, I may pronounce this name, so I apologize. Stasia, who submitted, what is the best way to describe work being done in underserved areas without unintentionally making people in those areas feel called out as being disadvantaged? And this one's for Frank.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. Appreciate the question as well. So I think this might, Carly, correct me if I'm wrong. I think this might have been the question that I kind of messaged you privately about. So there's a lot to unpack in that question itself. Yeah, saying how do we help underserved? So right there, that's a deficit frame. But it's like a meta moment of the question. But really, the answer is simple to me. You always do well. You do two things. One, you lead with aspiration. So talk about the things that are happening to them. But I always use this, and I think this is the critical piece. Describe the region, don't describe the people. So you can say people who come from historically under-resourced regions. I live in Tucson, and the south side of Tucson has historically been under-resourced. Or the eastern part, the northwestern part of Tucson, get the money. That's where the people live. So I always like to lead with, again, the positive language, so you can say, hey, the south side of Tucson, the community there, they're resilient. It is rich in art, culture, all of these things, and it's historically been under-resourced. And so if I frame it that way, you honor and uplift who they are while acknowledging that the region that they are in has historically been under-resourced. So again, I just move that language that tries to describe the population into describing the region that they're in.
That's really nice. I think there's a broader point there about the language too, and I think some people get afraid of these things and they get afraid to even speak because they don't want to use the wrong language. And I don't think that's what any of this is ever about. It's about commitment to a learning journey to sort of
Absolutely.
continuously get better. We're all learning together, especially as things change more so rapidly. So wonderful. Thank you for pointing that
Yeah.
out too.
I have a quick,
Yeah.
really quick, funny story. So underserved, like people who know me know that I don't like that word. And so I remember doing this conference, and the name of the actual nonprofit was the Underserved Community Foundation. And so she literally came up to me and was like, what do I do? And I didn't have an answer, but it was just like, but again,
Yeah.
it's really, what's the word? It's like in our DNA, historical way we talk
Yeah.
about things. It's literally how to disrupt your brain to disrupt those patterns that we've been taught over 20, 30, 40, 50 years.
Yeah. No, that's one language and
Can I add one thing to that? I just want to set the tone here, and that I've made every mistake imaginable in depiction and narrative and framing and communications. I'm also a gay man of a certain age, so I know what harmful narrative feels like from the AIDS era. Despite the personal experience I've had, I went on to do those harms throughout my career. So this isn't about blame or shame. It's more about, we've been conditioned to approach this in a certain way, and it's time to recondition ourselves. And, for me, it's part of my apology tour, but this is not, I know better than anybody. I've made every mistake, and that's why I have something to talk about.
Agreed. Unlearn to relearn. Absolutely.
Wonderful. No, beautifully put. Beautifully put. All right, so let's go into question number 3. Topic is avoiding stereotyping, and this is from Mary. What are some common indicators or words that may point to tokenism versus true representation? Sabrina, this one's for you.
Well, this is one of my favorites because I've been, as Marshall mentioned, I've been guilty of some things myself. And so I'll say this, avoid using stigmatizing labels, you know, things such as at-risk youth. So my background is I worked with youth for over 20 years. And for a long time, people would use the term at-risk youth or low-income families. And that instead focuses on describing their circumstances. But I think we should really try to focus on their circumstances. I apologize. So it'd be like youth that's facing challenges, or youth in underserved, which Frank doesn't like, underserved communities, right? So we're still learning in this process. And so I think that we have to be careful of the words that we use. And especially when we're talking about at risk, that's one of the words. Like, I grew up as an at-risk kid. I spent 20 years working with at-risk youth, and people immediately stigmatize what at-risk is. And so we had to go through this whole process of defining, is that really what you're talking about? You're not talking about at-risk youth, you're talking about youth with potential, right? So call out the positive. And so that is where I lay, anytime that you are thinking about labeling a community poor or disadvantaged, make sure that you are looking for the positive language that respects individuals' dignity and what they bring to the table, because all of those words are very negative words.
Beautiful. Yeah. Yeah. You froze for a second, and you froze in a very good position. That shows your passion for the subject. But no, that was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. It's absolutely, it's live entertainment, right?
So Frank, underserved, I have to get underserved out of my mind, because that is a word that I have used, and I probably used it yesterday. And so I'm going to consciously work on, as Marshall says, we're learning as we go. I'm going to work on not using underserved.
It's very similar to
the
of course, it's very similar to the structure that Marshall said, like homeless people versus people experiencing homelessness. It's the same. Instead of saying underserved communities, you can say communities from under-resourced areas. So it's again it separates that out. So yes, I advocate for that.
And yeah. And one of the words that I don't use is homeless, because I work with a lot of agencies. They use the term unhoused.
Yep.
And so as we start to learn, we start to use different language structure.
Yeah, and the language you use tells the story of your organization, that conveys the values that are important to your organization, and donors appreciate that. So excellent, wonderful. All right, so I'm going to go to question 4. This one is on the topic of avoiding stereotyping, and this is from Megan. How can we ensure that we are avoiding themes of white saviorism, especially when telling stories about the impact of and relationship between the volunteers and staff and I'm going to say disadvantaged groups, but this is from the question, of course, and that just highlights that. And this is for Marina.
Yes, thanks very much, Chris, and greetings, everyone. Hi from Trinidad. Nice to be with you all. Well, a lot of what has been said prior set the tone, and I endorse a lot of what Frank said and Marshall and Sabrina. So I think that's important for us to recognize. Interestingly, I've started to think about the words that we use in terms of storytelling, and I'm sort of embracing the term of story stewardship, right? Because people tell their stories and we steward the stories, because the definition of stewardship is the careful and responsible management of something entrusted to one's care. So I think we start with a foundation of recognizing that we are stewards if we have an opportunity and a privilege to nurture and journey someone's story. So I think to answer the question, if there's an answer there, is to encourage them to tell their stories and recognize how you steward that story. I think it is important for us to be brave in this space. We see in real time that we are learning from each other. So there's grace that's given along with accountability, right? So I know it may seem like a roundabout answer, but I do hope that it nurtures and sparks and ignites for Megan an opportunity to think about how the stewardship happens and how the people who are involved in this opportunity and engagement tell their stories, which is part of what MemoryFox does, as well as intentional and the way that it's framed and for the Hood and Sabrina's organization. So I just want to leave it there for rumination.
Wonderful.
Can I give two visual quick examples of that?
Yeah, pop it up. Let's go.
Okay. So this is a typical white savior story. I call it no best positioning. An unnamed Black youth with a gratitude message. Basically, without this organization, I don't know what I would do. And so this is kind of that exactly what was being discussed in practice. This is a listen best approach. If you change your posture to listening better. Now he's got a name and a title, and he gives his advice. What needs to happen? Youth outreach workers need to be involved in youth-friendly shelters. The organizational message at the bottom says, hey, we listened to him. Now he's got a name. We followed his advice. We added social workers. We're co-designing with young people. So this makes the organization, in my mind, look a lot more capable. It also makes him look competent, not just empathetic, right? And then if you look at it broadly, this is an organization that works on immunization, predominantly on the continent of Africa. And it tells a couple of stories. The images, an unnamed Black girl, unnamed Black boys running in a field, Bill Gates turned into special art with a quote, a name and a title, an unnamed Black nurse or doctor, and a ridiculously happy unnamed Black mother with kids. So one story it tells us is that some people are worth listening to, and that's Bill, because he's got a voice, and some people aren't. Nobody else on the page has a voice. Nobody even has a name, right? The other thing that we do is we put 86% of our imagery internationally is women or kids alone or women with kids. We don't show couples together, so we don't feel like families are intact. We don't show kids in school often, so we think they're not getting educated. This is what it could look like. Now, image number one is the president of South Africa, who's the head of the African response to COVID, talking about his advice. There's a married couple who are named, and they give their advice. Bill keeps his real estate because he certainly deserves it. The nurse gets her real estate and her name and guidance too. So here, everyone looks competent and like a contributor. And these are just some ways that you can think about visually what the difference is. And the interesting thing is that it's pretty imperceptible, the changes, but what you start to do is ask different questions and perceive people differently.
May I add as well to
Oh,
that part? So the other piece, I think, because I'm reading the question, so how can we avoid the themes of white saviorism? So I do this session around, it's called How to Engage Donors Using Community-Centered Practices. And one of the themes that I talk about in there is creating a sense of belonging. You know, we often other donors, and so that I think contributes to the white savior complex because it's these poor kids over here, or it creates that authoritarianism component. So finding opportunities to create a sense of community through language is critical. So you can say, hey, this is our community as you're talking to the donor. You don't say these kids need your help. It's like, you know, these kids need our help, and can you be a part of that? So that's an inclusive way of bringing, I think, those two groups together and starting the road to avoiding that white savior complex.
I also do recognize that Amber and Natalia's specific questions with regards to anonymity and confidentiality, which are very, very important and something I would get to when it comes to organizational responsibility, particularly when we're considering consent, because that's a whole conversation about how consent actually is given. And so, as Marshall would have pointed out, that is when visuals are put forward, and there should be very serious consent where that is concerned, where naming is concerned, and anonymity. I think from a research perspective, that's slightly different. Not that that was what was being said, but it is an important question. How do we balance that? So it's something when we get into tactics that we could discuss further.
yeah, we could do a whole seminar on consent, it feels like, and all the nuances of it. So,
Yeah.
all right, cool. We'll keep going then. So question number 5, story collection strategies. And this is from Aaron. What is the best time to capture stories from our clients? We have run into issues where we capture content early in the process of providing services, but our process is long and often affected by outside factors, and their perspectives change later. Frank, we'll kick it to you, and I know Marshall, you had something you wanted to add, and certainly if anybody
Yeah.
else wants to join in.
And I'm gonna give this all to my buddy. I saw her already in the chat room, Diana.
Diana,
So
woo.
I'm gonna be parroting what you say, Diana, but I think honestly, if it's a long process, so let's say you did the interview early on, and now this long process, maybe some aspects of change in that process. Just go back to that person and say, does this story still make sense? Let them know all of the new pieces of the information that have laid to the ground, and then again, get their consent again or adjust. But absolutely, I involve them every step of the process, even after the interview. Continue to reach out to them to make sure that it still makes sense for them, that it's honoring them as changes have happened.
Marshall, did you say you had some additional points to that earlier when we were talking?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly thinking through the script, right? Who's in charge of the script? Is it a story that you're telling and you're controlling that? Or is it a story that you're ceding control to community and saying, what's the story you want to tell and how do we best capture that? So that really shifts how you would think about that process. So if the community is wanting to tell a story in a certain way, it might mean you talk to people in a different cadence than you would originally thought. And so I would say, you know, my go-to is ask people, do you want to be represented? A, if so, how? And then what advice and guidance do you have? What would you like to say? Because what I've found is that people are so conditioned to respond with a certain type of story, like you're asking me something, so I know I have to give you trauma, circumstance, condition. So if you ask me to tell my story in my own words, I'm going to tell you that story because that's what I'm expected to tell. So we have to make it very clear to people that we want you to first come with your advice and guidance. If you want to tell your story, you can, but more importantly, what is that piece of guidance? And I'll give one anecdote. When I was at the Hilton Foundation that worked on people experiencing homelessness, and we did a video for the board, and the board was interested in the work, and I did the interview and I asked a woman, you could tell your story or not. People told it, but more importantly, what's your advice? She gave her advice. She said more mental health workers with the street teams get people into care and housing that much faster. She was given a title. Her name was there. That was her bit of advice. One of the Hilton family members stopped the video and said, wait, during the board meeting. Are we following what she said in our strategy? So what could have been a moment where he felt sorry for a woman living outside became a moment where he was taking advice from somebody with real experience with a checkbook asking about our strategy. And he didn't ask why he wasn't feeling sad. He just asked a different question about her advice. And it was very telling to me.
It's powerful. Yes. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. Okay. All right. Question number 6. And this is a little more fundraising specific from Jenny. How can we showcase the yucky side of our mission to help donors truly understand, but avoid being too graphic? For context, we work with survivors of domestic violence and abuse, but this question is relevant to several missions. This one is for Sabrina.
What I always say to this question is you have to get creative and you have to tell the story from a different perspective. Hopefully you can still hear me. But especially when you are talking about some battered spouse, tell the story from that bag that's packed in the closet, that bag that that someone who's been battered is there, is waiting for you to get the courage for when you want to leave. Tell it from that point of view. If you're working with youth, tell the story from the point of view of, if you're working with youth, because I work with youth, you got a gym, you got a basketball. Tell the story from that basketball point of view. If you're working with the unhoused and your mission is getting people from being unhoused to housed, tell the story from that box that they use for their house to turning into the moving box into their new home. And so you have to get creative in that imagery around that. One of the things that we did as well when I was with my organization working with youth is we paired them with an artist, and they shared their story with the artist. And then the artist took that story and turned it into an art piece. And it became very therapeutic for them, but it was allowing them to tell their story, but have it reflected in artwork. So you just have to get creative in that process. And it's not always about showing a person. You can tell the story from an inanimate object. That would be my best advice to you. I don't know if anyone else has any input around that, but that's what I've seen that has worked in this. Someone said whether artists paid or volunteers. They were volunteers because that we asked them to be. That's what usually happens. If you ask artists to volunteer, they will volunteer. But that was one of the best projects we ever did because it's a one-on-one conversation with the artists, and the kids were able to share their story in their own words. And then it turned into an art piece. And so they saw their journey in that art. And we were able to share the journey through the art piece with donors. And then we actually sold the paintings, and the kids got back, I think whatever we sold it for, the kids got back like 50% of the artwork payment.
Oh, that's beautiful. Anybody else? I feel like this is a really important, really interesting topic in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I just to add, Sabrina, I love that. And just to add a little to that as well, it goes back to describing the situation, again, versus describing the people in that space. So yeah, I mean, I loved your response, Sabrina. So again, I just would lean on describing the situation. Okay, sorry, my brain started to flitter away and now it came back. So here's what I was going to say. So it's very easy to talk about describe, and I'll give you an example of migrant. So this happened a few years ago in regards to a fast pitch program where you get a 3-minute opportunity, 3 minutes to do a fast pitch to a bunch of donors. And so this gentleman's first iteration of his story, his pitch, was to describe the migrant as dirty, smelly, all of these really negative base adjectives. And I asked him, is that something that you would like to be described as? And he was like, no. And so you can talk about the situation, the long journey, what was left behind. Why is he even making this journey into the US? Talk about that. Don't talk about these things where it just conjures up nobody would want to be described as that. So I wanted to land on that because what Sabrina said was absolutely correct. It's the situation that matters. It's not all of the yucky side. So don't talk about bruises. Don't talk about all of those things. Talk about being in that space with all the stuff that's around you, that's happening, that has caused this situation.
And going back to the competent side as well, one could say, I've been through some stuff. I'm not going to talk about it. But what I'll tell you is these are the things that mattered, and these are the things that need to change, right? And you can follow up with statistics about what's happening in a community that kind of drive the more negative points home. But again, who are you casting as competent and who are you casting as empathetic is a question to start with.
Okay, all right. We will charge ahead. So that was so building a culture of ethical storytelling, which I think for a lot of people is kind of tough because most people here are probably trying to build a culture of ethical storytelling at their organizations and maybe having a hard time getting it over the line. So this is from Caitlin. How do you communicate the importance of ethical storytelling and gain buy-in from within an organization? And this is for Marina.
Excellent question, because you set the tone from an organizational standpoint where culture is concerned. So thank you for this question. What I would say is have a measurable plan, right? And because in the interest of time, I wouldn't go into much detail, but I would say there are 3 pillars that I consider when you're thinking of a strong plan in your organization to be able to shift the paradigm. One is looking at your people. And when you look at your people, assess who you have, literally look at your organizational structure, who is part of this process, assess and analyze their competence, what they have. Then go to concur or counter, right? So think about what are things that they already have in terms of their strengths. Do you need to add any assets in that regard? And then you implement and monitor, right? So that's one from the people pillar. The second is look at your processes. So there are existing processes within your organization. So they could be performance reviews, after action reviews. There are things that are already embedded in the process of either the organizational cycle or a project, right? The life cycle of a project or an employee's life cycle. And really start to think about opportunities to assess how are we looking at the ethical story stewardship or ethical storytelling within that scope. I could get into more detail, but I'm just kind of giving those to you. The third thing is your product, right? So look measurably at your product. You might say, we want 100% of our annual reports to have no harmful language. And we could measure it from some of the resources that Frank gives or intentional or Sabrina. And you can measure that, right? A simple search in the document could say, do we have the word disadvantage? You know, and within what context? Because it may be out of context and it's fine. So you can measure that. We would say 50% of our proposals have a certain kind of language. So I would come to those points, look at those three pillars, your people, your processes, and your products, and you have a measurable plan. So you're looking at this, you are being committed, because part of it is that we fall off the wagon because we get, you know, impatient, we get to kind of like, I don't know if it's really working, but the reality is that our funders or investors are changing, right? There's a society that's changing and more aware of this. And those that we are partnering with in community are also more aware. So let's not feel like we have to stick with the status quo. We have to be brave and take the risk, but have a plan. And those three pillars are what I would kind of put forward. So hopefully that helps a bit, a measurable plan.
Yeah,
Can I
that's
add one thing?
wonderful. Yeah.
One thing onto that, Marina, I 100% agree. And I've led communications at different levels throughout my career. One thing has rung true in all of those positions. I've never really had to ask permission from anybody to develop the assets I was developing. So the board didn't see these, the CEO didn't see them. I had a control that I didn't realize at the time. And so doing all those things is 100% the right way to do it. And you can simply much more than you think, just start making these changes without talking about it and show the progress, because that can happen too. When I showed you those examples visually, there's no difference between what A and B look like. You just respond differently. So you can just do this without permission. That's the permission I'm giving you. Do it.
Yeah. No, it's true. It's like viral, you know, things going viral, they change. You don't even know it's there. It's like, what? It's like, and then we just change the whole
What's
thing.
that phrase? Like, do it and then like ask for forgiveness.
Ask for
later.
forgiveness.
Oh,
After.
sorry.
That's
Yeah.
right.
You'll get
Well,
praise, I promise.
you'll never have to apologize for things like if you give people, for example, a way to withdraw consent for stories, right? If you provide that to your storytellers, I mean, you don't need board approval, you know, for something like that. And I don't think they would blink an eye about it. So there's probably, to your point, a lot of things that you can do without without having to get formal consent from your bosses. So or consent, maybe I'm using that wrong. But okay, cool. Anything else to chime in on that one? Because that's a really gets to the heart of what the issue is. It isn't always the will.
I should have I should have written it down, Marina. That was beautiful. Like 3 pillars. Like,
Don't you worry, it's coming
Ooh.
up.
We're all gonna follow your slide.
Drop it in the
What were those
chat.
3 pillars again?
Absolutely.
Wonderful, wonderful. All right, so let's move on to question number 8. Story collection strategies. This is from Melissa. How do you navigate the dichotomy of your organization's sense of urgency? We need a story right now for a donor, with working at the speed of trust. I love that phrase, the speed of trust. That's really interesting. I'm going to think a lot more about that. But this one's for Marshall.
A couple of ways to go about that. I have found that my focus historically was very narrow on the people being served that we were meant to serve. But there's a lot there's a much bigger story that could be told. If it was the provision of a health intervention, right? The story could be told through the private sector who developed the intervention. It could be told through the government that's building the program to get it into people's hands. It could be told through a health worker that's doing that programming. So I think you can tell a story about the more complex nature of solving problems is done in partnership, right? And so how are we zooming out from just the end user thanking you for whatever you did to make their lives better to the whole ecosystem of people playing their roles, from the people in community saying, this is what we need, to the other actors saying, hey, we can do that, and this is what we can do. And so I think there's another way that you can get at having some of those in the bank if there's an urgent matter coming up, that could help tell a different story that people might read as novel for people.
It's almost like having a story bank that you're a curator of. It's your stories of your organization, your community members.
Yep, but
You'll have
expand
it at
the,
your fingertips when you need it.
yep, expand the cast to include private sector, to
Wonderful.
include government, to include philanthropy, to include experts in community. So you've got lots of people telling stories in a different way.
Cool, I love it. Anyone else? Wonderful. All right, we'll go on to number 9 then. This is about revisiting consent, and this is from Michelle. What is your advice regarding attaining informed consent on stories, especially from children? And Sabrina, this one's for you.
Well, this one's for me. Like I said, I work with kids for over 20 years, right? And what we did and what I have seen work is we got consent right up front from the parents and to tell stories, but it wasn't just getting the consent right up front. It was getting the consent up front, but the language that we used to get the consent was very plain spoken language. Not only that, we did have our legal review the language so we can make sure that all the bases were covered. And outside of that, it's not just having that consent up front. When we actually used their story, we went back and got their consent again, right? Because you know how it is in this world. Like, again, I work with kids, so we're signing our kids up for a program and we're just signing off on everything. We're not really reading anything. And then you all of a sudden see your child in a newspaper or a picture of your child in a newspaper or anything like that. We went back and we got consent again. And there's some things that we really didn't do. We don't use a child's full name. We may use their first name and last initials. We don't want to give out that type of information. And so for each program and in each way we were going to use their story, we went back and got consent from the parent, and also not just the parent, but from the child, because it is their story. It is theirs, right? And so in doing that, you want to make sure that you honor that child and if they want their story to be told and how their story is being told. And we share that information with them. And so that's how we went about consent. Of course, with the legal side of things, we got it up front, legal language, but in a plain way that parents had questions, we could answer those questions. But as we're going through that journey, because you have to remember, for us, kids were with us from the time they were 6 years old all the way till they were 18 years old. Our program was a success. That's how long they were with us. So within that journey, there were several times when their stories could be told. So for each time their story was told, each program that they went through, they reconsented for us to use their story throughout the way. So that is the best way that I've seen for it to happen.
If I may ask a follow-up question, then, did you tend to do this digitally, or would you do it all, print something off and have them physically sign these documents? And
Ours was
upload them to a
print.
shared drive?
Ours was print off and physically have them sign the documents. I know in this day and age you can do that electronically, right? A lot of people will do that, but for the people that we served, it was better for us to have it printed, read it, ask any questions that you may have, and fill it out. We did have the option for the initial membership to be done electronic, but again, as you're going through the process and you're asking people to reconsent to their story being told, that was not electronic at all. That was a conversation. This is how we're going to tell the story. This is how we're going to use it, and getting the reconsent that way.
This is how we're going to use it. I love that part. That part's so,
Yes.
so important.
Yes.
Anyone else? Because I feel like everybody probably has different experiences when it comes to this.
This is
Other tips.
This is one I really, really struggle with, because if an organization is providing services to a community, do people actually feel like they have the agency to say no, right? It makes consent a lot harder, true consent to get harder to get, because I'm getting something in return that might feel at risk. And so it's a hard one, and I don't have a good answer for it, except that pivot to advice and guidance. So and again, I question, should little kids be pictured at all? Could you picture the back of their heads? Or like, how could you do it when a child can't give consent and the parents might feel obligated to give consent? So it's a tricky one too. If you pivot, if I think about myself, do I want to be the poster child for something in perpetuity on the internet?
Am I run for president someday? Yeah, exactly.
Probably not. But if I were in that position, giving my advice and guidance as an expert, even if I'm a kid, I might feel slightly different about it. So I think the content you're capturing is one. And again, this is a sticky one that I don't have a great answer for. You know, I think, Sabrina, what you outlined is the best of the best that we can do, given the reality of what it is.
Mm-hmm. And can I just add a little to that as well?
Please.
I have a real world example where I did something like that, and then in reflection, I'm like, I shouldn't have put the weight on the person to say, hey, can I use your real image? Can I use your real face? And can we use your whole name? She didn't know any better. She said, yeah. And the story, and then mind you, really quick, just it was a story. It was a year-end appeal. We focused, the reason why I do the work I do is because of this mistake. We focused on her tribulations. We focused on the hardships, barely focused on her resiliency, that she was back in school and etc. And used her real name, used her real picture. One of her classmates who did not get along with her saw the story and made fun of her. Then she read the story and was like, I did not consent to this. And it was a painful lesson. And so yeah, to Marshall's point, it's sticky, because even if they say yes, should I have even asked the question? You know, and certainly that was just, this is literally the reason why I'm here doing this, because I don't want anybody out there to make the same mistake I did in that regard.
You know, it's interesting that you say that, because again, like I said, I spent 20 years in an organization, and one of their biggest fundraising efforts is around a program of naming the youth of the year. And the conversation has been, the last couple of years, we talk about poverty porn. Like, are we highlighting these kids because of their struggle, right? And is this what it is? Is that what we're doing? And it's been a huge struggle, because you do want to share that the kids that you're working with are truly overcoming or coming from some challenging situations, and that what the program is doing is helping them overcome those challenges. But at the end of the day, is it poverty porn? Like, are you putting it on display for the world to see, to feel sorry for them, you know? And so it's been a real struggle, and we're at a crossroads to see which way we're going to go with this, because it goes back to that language of at risk, to changing it from the kids that need us the most. And how do you define at risk? And is a person that comes from 2-parent working household, are they considered at risk because they don't come home to mama and daddy? You know, they come home to an empty house because they're both working. Now, is that something that should be elevated when you're talking about the youth of the year? So it's been this ongoing conversation around and around, and it really is a challenge, and it is a mindset shift for not only the organizations, but also for the donors and for the staff when you're working within that model.
Yeah.
The other thing
Wonderful.
I
Yeah.
think about is, you know, I have a talk that I give, and I started by saying, shout out a single word you would use to define or describe yourself. People put in the chat, ambitious, curious, confident, happy, whatever. Nobody puts poor, marginalized, disenfranchised, vulnerable. Why not? Because nobody wants to be depicted that way. And so in telling a story, we tend to tell the story that most benefits our organization and that narrow sliver. If the aperture was wider and said, like, how do we build connective tissue between people? Like, I like soccer, or God, I hate reading, and this, school sucks right now, but I have a lot of friends and it's fun. Like, things everyone can relate to. Oh, and here's something else I'm going through. But if we tell a more fulsome picture and story of somebody, I think we will find that we connect with them on a more human, person to person way than just, I feel sorry for you. It's more, oh, we share those things in common that I didn't really know about, but now I do because someone gave you the space to tell that part of you.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, we got one more question and then we'll get to our wrap up question. This last one's for Marina. And we've talked about this a lot, I think, at this point, but it's interesting to call it out. So using asset-based language, this is from Kristen. What are some words or phrases that shouldn't be used when storytelling that would further colonialism, racism, et cetera, all these difficult topics? It would be interesting to hear your thoughts on that, Marina.
Yeah, powerful. As you said, Chris, a lot of it we've already touched on, but interestingly, there's some deep words that seem so normal that we sometimes use. And I've kind of chosen 3. I actually quite like the work of one of the writings by Anne Hendricks Jenkins, and the title, I'll share it with Carly so she could share it with our audience. It's Time to Put an End to Supremacy Language in International Development. That's a piece that I go back to quite often. So for example, we use the word, the field, right? So that has colonial legacy. I mean, I come from Trinidad and Tobago. We were a colony. We understand that the field is a plantation setting where you have the great house and then you have the field. So you understand that dynamic already. But when we're talking about the field, we're speaking about countries. Just say the context, just say the country, just say the location, and not necessarily the field. Now, it might feel like, okay, but I use this so often, it's benign. I myself very often I'm confronted by it, but I encourage us to think about that as one example. Beneficiaries is a word that we use, and I think it has a level of benevolence in it, but it also is framed in dependency, right? So we might want to think about that when we might say our community experts instead. Marshall spoke a lot about reframing the actors in this thing that we're in, or people we work with. For example, it has to be contextual, because we sometimes want to put a word that's easy when we have to do the proposal quickly or what have you. Another word that we use is target population, or phrase rather, and that has military legacy, actually. So when we think about a target, we think about it in that way. Now, of course, we might say, oh, just leave it, it's no big deal. But again, when we're thinking about really elevating ourselves and the way that we use language and the message that we are sending. So there may be, I really like Frank's work when it comes to actual replaced words. So I might say, don't use this, but what do we use instead? Because we want to convey a message. So we may say, instead of target population, our main partners, or something else like that. We can also start to really contemplate. So there's a lot of work there, but it's an excellent question, because then you start to really get, and you could see that I'm a very tactical person. So thinking about how you actually plan and tactically and strategically do these things. So really, I really like that question, but open to other panelists for their points of view as well.
I love
anyone
this
else?
question. Yeah, I love it. So thank you, Marina, and Carly put something in the chat box. So I actually have a document that talks. I call it the Introductory Guide in Using Asset-Based Language. I know Sabrina and Marina have a copy of it. So I really encourage you to click on that link. And it's just a starter guide of how to use different words for the words that have historically been used, that have created this connotation in our mind. Like what Sabrina said with at risk, that's like literally the number one. When you say at risk today, who do you think of? You think of Black and brown kids. So there's opportunities and ways to shift language by simple movement of the language And the other piece I want to say, and I think it says it in the document, be prepared. Language shifts and changes. Things that we thought were appropriate 10 years ago, they're not appropriate now. And so it's just really, that's the other piece. So everything that we're talking about now, I would hope most of it sticks. But as
10 years from now,
we don't know. We don't know. It's like, why did I say under-resourced? It was horrible. And so anyway, so just know that we're all on this learning journey together. But as long as we're moving in a place that honors and uplifts our communities, primarily those of color and those in poverty, then we're on the right track. So I really appreciate this conversation and that question particularly.
Wonderful. Yeah, I think people get a little scared and that's okay. But I think, like you said, I mean, it's about the learning journey, so. All right. So we're going to do our wrap up question. This is the final question. This is for everybody. We're going to start with Frank. This is about storytelling strategies from Neil. All right. So what is the best way to tell someone else's story that includes hardships without an exploitive narrative? Now, we've talked a little bit about this, but if you can say your best, and we'll just go, I'll just call out the next person.
Yeah, this is great because when I give my presentation, the one I mentioned earlier about how to engage donors using community-centered practices, there often becomes like, well, so I have to say all positive things. I can't say what the issue is. And it's like, no, you have to say what the issue is. So it's all about framing. It's all about what you lead with. So the best thing I can say is you lead with their aspirations, and then you talk about the actual systemic the reason why the systemic disparities exist. So again, a simple one would be like, instead of saying at-risk youth, you could say a Black student striving to succeed in her community that has been historically under-resourced. Gives a much better framing of what that is. So to me, it's always leading with the aspirations. I gave the example earlier about South Tucson, and this is literally truth. Rich in culture, rich in art, rich in music, and yet it's still historically under-resourced. So to me, that's a great way to honor somebody's story by leading with their aspirations first.
Awesome. Next, we'll go Marshall.
I would say, if possible, don't tell their story for them. Let them tell their story themselves in whatever way they would like to. But beyond that, yes to ethical storytelling, yes to asset-based framing. But again, if you're trying to solve an issue, start with the advice and guidance of the person that you're talking about, because what that does is change the perception of the viewer, listener, reader of the capability of people in community to be co-creators of solutions versus receivers of services, right? So start with advice and guidance, give space if they want to tell their story. If they don't, that's cool.
Wonderful. All right, next we'll go Sabrina.
That, Marshall, you're right on it. Mine was like amplify their voice. Let them tell their story. It is their story. Allow them the opportunity to amplify their own voices in the way that they want their story to be told. And so that's probably the best tip that I could give you. When people have the ability to tell their own story in their own words, it empowers them. And ultimately, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to empower the people that we serve. So allow them to be empowered by having the ability to share their own story.
All right, then Marina, take us home.
Just the wrap up of all of it, there's everything I endorse. I think the only thing I would add is stick by your decision. As leaders, we have to be brave. And sometimes you may put at the corner of your website and say, this is how we're doing things now, right? As Marshall said, you could quietly do it, but you're not changing. You are staying the course, so that you are standing by your decision to do this. You're not wavering because you know it's a better way. And you have allies right here in this conversation. So know that you're not alone and that we can stay connected. What Marshall said, I really, build connective tissue between people. That is what we're here for. So all what was said before, and stay the course, be unapologetic.
Well, I think I would speak for everybody here is if anybody does run into challenges, they could reach out to any of you with questions or even just a quick tip on how to deal with somebody, maybe a board member who's being obstinate. I'm sure you all have experienced that before. And so I encourage anyone to please reach out to our lovely panelists. So, all right. Well, we did it. We are under 4, or it's almost 4 o'clock here Eastern time. So we'll close it up. So thank you all so much. I think we're all very appreciative of the energy that you approach these topics and certainly the aptitude you have for being able to dive deep into them. So I will do a quick MemoryFox demo for anybody who's interested, of course. I love to do that at the end. But first, I do want to make sure we keep this conversation going. We created a Narratives with Integrity LinkedIn group. Carly's going to go ahead and drop that in the chat so that if anybody it's brand new. We just want to kind of give a platform to these types of conversations. We're sort of obsessed with it. I know I personally am. And so there's something punk rock about it that I very much enjoy. So we very much want to continue this conversation further, especially as it changes over time. If you have not, I assuming pretty much everybody here, if you haven't downloaded a copy of the 2023 Ethical Storytelling Report, go ahead and grab it. Certainly we'll be putting out some more content as time goes on, especially from a lot of our thought leaders. And then finally, I hope to see you all at our next installment of Narratives with Integrity. Save the date for Tuesday, June 11th at 3 p.m. Eastern time. We're going to discuss how to build a culture of ethical storytelling at your organization, which we talked about a little bit earlier, how difficult that can be, surprisingly, but some interesting ideas on how to actually make that happen. So yes, if anybody wants to hang out, otherwise, please have a great day, and thank you all for what you do and making the world a better place.
Thanks
I'm
for
gonna
having
go
Thank you.
share my screen real quick.
Thank you.
Yes, have a wonderful day.
Thanks.
All right. So I'm just going to throw up this one slide right here just to kind of show you all how it works at a high level. So MemoryFox is a DIY software that helps you collect stories from your community, keep them all organized in one place, and design all that content into amazing ways, either using our free video editor and story presentation tools or using our Canva integration. And I don't know if y'all have used Canva before. Canva's the best thing in the world. We definitely do. It's amazing. It's free. So I highly recommend checking it out. We are integrated with it so you can pull your content right into there and do all kinds of cool things with it. It's sort of an end-to-end storytelling solution that streamlines your entire storytelling process from that's going to make your life a lot easier, while also doing so in a way that considers modern methods of ethical storytelling like we talked about today. For example, we have a way for contributors to withdraw consent. We're looking at building ways that will notify people every time their piece of content is used. We're trying to really dive deep into that stuff. And so I look forward to kind of expanding on that. So thank you all for your time. Carly's going to drop. And so that's all we have today. So I think we dropped all the links. So thank you all. Please reach out anytime and tell great stories. Appreciate you all.